They reached the page where my name should have been, and my uncle turned it so fast the paper snapped against his thumb. Someone coughed. Someone looked at the carpet, and my cousin whispered, "Just keep going." There were 8 people in the room and 3 empty chairs along the wall, but only one of us had been quietly erased before the reading even began. I did not speak, because the missing name was not the only thing they had tried to hide. If you have ever watched people act innocent while doing something deliberate, stay with me until the end. Because what happened in that room was not about forcing my way into a family that did not want me. It was about letting the right document show them I had been there all along. My name is Audrey Bell. I was 32, and I worked as a billing specialist for a physical therapy practice in Ashford County. I knew how to track a missing line item, how to read a statement nobody wanted to explain, and how to sit quietly until numbers told the truth. I was also my grandmother's legal granddaughter, though half my family preferred calling me the girl Rose took in. Let me back up. My grandmother, Rose Bell, owned a square brick house on Hickory Lane, 9 acres of garden land behind it, a small rental cottage, and the closed bakery building where she had worked for 36 years before buying it herself. She was not flashy, but she was steady in the old way. Her pantry had labels, her checkbook balanced to the penny, and her kitchen clock ran 4 minutes fast because she said late people made bad decisions. I came to live with her when I was 10. My mother, Rose's youngest daughter, had struggled with addiction for years and disappeared for long stretches. My father was never part of the story in any useful way. After one winter where I missed 27 days of school, my grandmother petitioned for guardianship, then later adopted me when my mother signed the papers during a sober month that did not last. The adoption was quiet because Grandma wanted my childhood to stop being an argument. She told her 2 sons, Martin and Joel, and her older daughter, my Aunt Serena, but she did not announce it to every cousin at Thanksgiving. She said, "A child does not need a committee to belong." That sentence became one of the foundations of my life. The problem was that Martin never accepted it. He was the oldest son, 58 when everything happened, and he believed family lines should stay neat enough to benefit him. He had borrowed from Grandma for years, never in amounts big enough to make a scene, always with promises dressed up as temporary need. Joel was quieter but easily led, and Serena loved appearances more than truth. They treated my adoption like paperwork that could be acknowledged when it helped and ignored when it cost them something. Grandma knew. She knew because she missed nothing. In 2019, after a small stroke made her hands weak for several weeks, she met with an attorney named Ms. Havel and created the Bell Family Trust. The house, garden land, cottage, and bakery building were transferred into the trust by recorded deed. Her will poured any remaining assets into that trust and named me successor trustee. Martin, Joel, and Serena were beneficiaries of cash gifts and some personal items, but the real property would remain in trust for at least 24 months after Grandma's death. The trust also gave me the right to live in the house during that period, because Grandma said it had been my home since childhood. The rental income from the cottage and bakery building would maintain the property. If the trust later sold anything, the remainder would be divided according to the schedule Grandma chose, with me receiving the house share and the others receiving cash distributions. It was not a punishment. It was her way of keeping the home from being sold in the first wave of grief and greed. She asked me not to discuss it. "Martin will count every doorknob before I am dead," she said. "Let him count air if he wants. Paper will count better later." I asked if secrecy would make them angrier. "Probably," she said, stirring soup like she had just predicted rain. "But anger is not the same as authority." The day she signed the trust, I drove her to Miss Havel's office and sat beside her because her hand still tired easily. The notary read my full legal name from my driver's license, Audrey Rose Bell, and Grandma squeezed my wrist under the table. When Miss Havel reviewed the adoption decree as part of the estate file, Grandma said, "Make sure nobody calls her informal after I am gone." Miss Havel looked up from the file. "The decree is certified. There is nothing informal about it." On the ride home, Grandma seemed peaceful in a way I had not seen since her stroke. We stopped at the old bakery building because she wanted to see whether the new tenant had painted the front window. The building smelled like dust and sugar even after years of being used as a frame shop. Grandma put one hand on the glass and said, "A family can forget on purpose. Records are for when memory gets convenient." I did not know then how exact those words would become. The adoption itself had been just as quiet and just as permanent. I remembered the courthouse hallway, the brown bench, and the way my sneakers did not touch the floor when I sat. Grandma wore a blue dress and carried a folder with my school records, my birth certificate, and 3 letters from teachers who said I had started bringing lunch every day. My mother arrived late, cried before the judge spoke, and signed where she was told. I did not understand then that love and failure could stand in the same room. After the hearing, the judge asked whether I understood that Rose would be my legal parent. I looked at Grandma because I was afraid of answering wrong. She nodded once, not pushing, just steady. I said, "She already is." The judge smiled in a tired way and said, "Then the law is catching up." Grandma kept that sentence. She wrote it on the inside flap of the adoption folder, along with the date and the time. When I was older and embarrassed by how much paper she saved, she told me, "One day you may need proof that love did not happen casually." I hated that she was right. I hated that belonging could be so obvious in a kitchen and still require a seal for other people. But I learned from her that legal proof was not an insult to love. It was protection for it. The first small overreach came 6 months before she died. Grandma had started using a cane, and I was spending every evening at the house after work. One Tuesday, I arrived with groceries and found Martin in the front hall taking pictures of the staircase, the dining room, and the built-in cabinet where Grandma kept her china. "Why are you photographing the house?" I asked. He did not lower the phone. "Inventory." Grandma did not ask for an inventory. "She is 84, he said. "Someone has to be realistic." Grandma heard him from the sitting room. Realistic people asked before opening drawers. Martin laughed like she had made a joke, but he put the phone away. Later, while I made tea, she said, "Watch people who call their wanting practical." The second pressure thread came through Joel's daughter, Nina. Nina was 29 and renting the cottage behind Grandma's house at half the market rate while she finished a teaching certificate. Martin began telling her that if I had control, I would raise the rent or push her out so I could sell the land. That was false, but Nina was already worried about money, and worry makes lies sound responsible. Nina called me late one night. "Uncle Martin says Grandma promised the cottage would stay with his side because he helped repair it. He replaced one porch rail. He said you keep correcting everyone like you are already in charge. I am not in charge. Then why does everyone act scared of asking you things?" That question hurt because I knew the answer. Grandma asked me to keep receipts, medications, tenant notices, and appointment cards because I showed up. Martin turned that into gatekeeping because gatekeeping sounded uglier than care. The bigger overreach happened 5 weeks before Grandma died. She had been home from the hospital for 3 days after a heart failure scare, and Martin came over with Joel and Serena. He had a typed list of items he called expected family distributions. The list gave him Grandma's bedroom set, the bakery building keys, and authority to coordinate sale discussions. Joel would get the garden equipment. Serena would get jewelry. I was listed under personal effects to be determined. Grandma read the list from her recliner, lips pressed together. "You made a menu of my house." Martin said, "Mom, we are trying to prevent confusion. You are trying to start it early." Serena sighed. "Audrey, do you see what happens when you make her suspicious?" Grandma tapped the arm of her chair. "Audrey brought soup. You brought a shopping list." The room went very quiet. Martin folded the paper slowly. He looked at me, not at her, and said, "This is what happens when someone forgets she was taken in." Grandma stood up so fast I reached for her elbow. Her voice was low, but it carried. She was not taken in. She was adopted. And if you skip that truth again in my house, you can leave it. Martin left. Serena followed. Joel stayed long enough to look ashamed, then went after them. Grandma sat back down, breathing hard. I wanted to tell her we should show them the trust then and there. She shook her head before I even spoke. No. Let them reveal themselves without a map. Grandma died 41 days later, at 5:22 in the morning, in the bedroom where she had slept for nearly 50 years. I was in the chair beside her. Nina had come the night before and fallen asleep on the couch. Martin had said he would visit after a breakfast meeting. Serena had sent flowers while Grandma was still alive. For the first hour after she died, the house felt suspended. I called hospice, Ms. Havel, then Martin. He arrived before the funeral home and walked straight to Grandma's desk. "Where is the will folder?" he asked. "Miss Havel has the originals." He looked at me sharply. "Of course you called the lawyer first. Grandma asked me to." He gave a small, humorless smile. "She asked you a lot of things near the end." The funeral was 5 days later. Martin stood in the receiving line as if hosting a public event. Serena chose the flowers. Joel carried a framed photograph. I sat with Nina and tried to hear the hymn Grandma had chosen over the sound of relatives discussing who would stay at the house that night. Miss Havel scheduled the formal review for Thursday at 2. The notices went to me, Martin, Joel, Serena, Nina, and 2 other beneficiaries. The letter said the original will, trust certification, recorded deed, and adoption record would be reviewed. It also said any private copy or summary should not be relied upon without the attorney present. Martin ignored that. On Wednesday evening, Nina texted me that the family was meeting at Serena's house the next morning to go through Grandma's will calmly. I was not invited. Nina said Martin had found a copy in Grandma's old recipe drawer and planned to read it before the attorney complicated things. I called Ms. Havel. She told me not to confront them and asked me to come to her office before the formal review. "Bring your notice and your certified adoption decree if you have it," she said. "Do you think they will skip me?" She paused. "Your grandmother thought they might try." That answer sat with me all night. The next morning, Nina secretly video called me from Serena's hallway and kept her phone angled toward the dining room. I could not see much, only the edge of a table, Martin's sleeve, and a stack of papers. I could hear everything. Martin read the old 2014 will first. That will left personal property among her children and mentioned me in a paragraph about care and affection. It was written before the adoption was finalized and before the trust existed. When he reached the beneficiary list, he slowed. Then he skipped the paragraph with my name entirely. Nina whispered, "He passed it." Serena said quietly, "Martin, you skipped a line." He replied, "It is not operative." Joel muttered, "Read it anyway." Martin snapped, "They read the will and skipped my name on purpose when Grandma's sister died, and nobody reopened that mess. We are not making Audrey the center of this." That was the breaking point. They read the will and skipped my name on purpose, not because the page was unclear, not because grief confused them, but because acknowledging me made their version harder to sell. I felt the old child part of me rise, the 10-year-old who had once stood in doorways waiting to hear whether she belonged. But I also heard Grandma saying a child does not need a committee to belong. I heard her say records are for when memory gets convenient. So, I did not drive to Serena's house. I did not shout through Nina's phone. I took a screenshot of the call log, wrote down the time, and sent Ms. Havel one sentence. "They are reading the old will," and intentionally skipped the line naming me. That was my action. I preserved the fact, notified the attorney, and let the formal process move forward. Ms. Havel replied within 4 minutes. "Stay away from that room. Be here at noon." For the next hour, everything looked falsely calm. Nina texted that Martin had declared the house would be prepared for sale. Serena was making a list of china, and Joel had asked whether I should be told before items were moved. Martin said, "Audrey can hear what matters after the lawyer confirms it." Then the complications surfaced. Nina called me crying. Martin had told her the cottage rent would be reviewed immediately because the estate needed income. He also told her that if she supported me, she should not expect family consideration. The wrong reading had become leverage before the real one even began. At noon, I sat in Ms. Havel's office with my adoption decree in a folder on my lap. She reviewed it, then placed it beside the trust certification and recorded deed. "Your grandmother did not leave this to chance," she said. "It still hurts." "Documents do not prevent hurt," she said. "They prevent hurt from becoming authority." At 2, everyone arrived for the formal meeting. Martin looked irritated to see me seated beside Miss Havel. Serena would not meet my eyes. Joel looked tired. Nina sat near the door, still red-eyed but present. Martin started before Miss Havel could speak. "We already reviewed the family copy." Miss Havel folded her hands. "You reviewed a revoked document and skipped a named paragraph according to a witness." Serena's face went pale. Joel looked at Nina. Martin turned slowly toward me. "You had someone spy on us." Nina spoke before I could. "I called her because you skipped her." The room went still. Ms. Havel began the formal reading. The 2019 will revoked all prior wills and poured remaining assets into the Bell Family Trust. The trust held the house, garden land, cottage, and bakery building by recorded deed. I was named successor trustee. The adoption decree was attached to the estate file, not because it was necessary to make me family, but because Grandma wanted no one to pretend confusion. Then Miss Havel read the clause Grandma had added after Martin brought the distribution list. Any beneficiary who intentionally omitted, concealed, or misrepresented a named beneficiary's status during estate discussions would receive all required notices through counsel and could not remove property until inventory was complete. No personal property could be moved from the house for 90 days. Nina's cottage rent would remain unchanged for 12 months if paid on time. The house could not be sold, listed, or divided for 24 months. Martin's face changed first. Not into grief, into calculation, interrupted. "So Audrey controls the house," he said. "Audrey administers the trust," Miss Havel said. "The trust controls the house." Serena whispered, "Mom attached the adoption decree?" "Yes." "Why would she do that?" I answered before Miss Havel could. "Because you kept acting like belonging was optional." No one spoke for several seconds. The fallout became sharper when Ms. Havel read Grandma's letter. It was one page, in her firm handwriting, addressed to all of us. She wrote that love did not become smaller when it became legal, and adoption did not become less real because some relatives preferred older wording. She wrote that the house had been my home, Nina's cottage had been her shelter, and the family needed time before making decisions that could not be undone. Then Miss Havel read the sentence that broke Martin's posture. "If any of you try to make Audrey prove what the court and my life already proved, you are not defending blood. You are denying mine." Joel covered his face. Serena began to cry silently. Martin stared at the table as if the wood had betrayed him. Miss Havel did not let emotion replace procedure. She handed out preservation notices, trustee acceptance forms, and inventory rules. She also called the locksmith scheduled by Martin for the next morning and canceled the appointment while we were in the room. Martin had apparently planned to change the house locks for estate security. Miss Havel put the call on speaker. "Mr. Bell does not have authority to order that work," she told the locksmith. Martin's jaw tightened. "That was just precaution." "So is this," she said, placing the cancellation note in the file. Miss Havel then moved through the practical list with a calm that made Martin angrier than any accusation could have. She said the house locks would remain unchanged until the inventory was complete. She said the bakery tenant would receive written notice that rent still went to the trust account, not to any family member who stopped by with instructions. She said Nina's cottage lease would be confirmed by letter before sunset. She said no one was to remove Grandma's china, aprons, furniture, ledgers, jewelry, or garden equipment without a signed inventory receipt. Joel asked, "Do we really need all that for family things?" Ms. Havel looked at him. "Especially for family things." That sentence embarrassed everyone because it was true. Strangers usually know they need receipts. Family often believes memory will be enough, then remembers whatever helps them most. Before we left, Ms. Havel asked me to sign the trustee acceptance. She read the duty paragraph aloud. "Preserve the property. Account for income and expenses. Treat beneficiaries fairly. Communicate through proper notice. Avoid using the trust for personal punishment. I heard that last part like a warning written directly to the hurt place in me. This does not make you the winner, she said. I know. It makes you responsible. I looked at Martin, then at the old copy of the will on the table. That is heavier. Good, Ms. Havel said. It should be. The reveal happened after the meeting in the small courtyard behind Ms. Havel's office. Nina followed me outside, twisting her car keys in her hands. She looked younger than 29 in that moment. Audrey, I am sorry, she said. You called me. Only after he skipped you. That was when it mattered. She wiped her cheek. I thought if I stayed quiet, Mom and Uncle Martin would leave me out of it. But staying quiet just made me useful to them. Grandma protected your lease. I heard. She looked down. Why would she do that when I did not stand up sooner? Because she knew fear is not the same as betrayal. Nina looked at me then. Do you believe that? I am trying to. She nodded slowly. I want to help with the inventory. Not because I want things. Because I want things recorded, to be honest. That was the first offer all day that did not feel like a claim. The turn came that evening at Serena's house. Martin called another private conversation, but this time Nina refused to sit quietly. She called me afterward and told me what happened. Her voice shook, but underneath it was something steadier. He said, I embarrassed the family. What did you say? I said he embarrassed Grandma by skipping the granddaughter she adopted. I sat down on my kitchen floor. Nina continued. Mom told me I was being dramatic. Joel said no. Martin did skip the line. Then Uncle Martin said everyone was turning against him because of you. And I told him the trust did not create what he did. It recorded it. That sounded so much like Grandma that I closed my eyes. The next 60 days were quiet, formal, and necessary. Ms. Havel filed the will with the probate court, recorded my trustee acceptance, and sent notices to all beneficiaries. I opened a trust account for rental income and property expenses. Nina signed a lease acknowledgement. The bakery tenant received written notice that no one but the trustee could change lease terms. The house inventory took 4 weekends because Grandma had labeled everything, including the labels. Nina helped. Joel came twice and carried boxes without saying much. Serena came once, cried over my grandmother's aprons, and left early. Martin did not come. He requested copies of every document through his own attorney, and Ms. Havel sent what he was entitled to receive. One Saturday, while inventorying the upstairs cedar closet, Nina found a folder labeled Audrey's school papers. Inside were my adoption decree copy, old report cards, drawings, and a note Grandma had written after my first parent-teacher conference. Audrey looked surprised when they said family signature required. I signed slowly so she would see me do it. I sat on the floor and cried into my sleeve. Nina sat beside me without trying to make it better. She really did choose you every day, Nina said. I know. I think that is what scared him. Martin? All of them. If choosing counts, then they have to answer for what they chose. That was the deepest truth anyone had said yet. The bakery building brought another test. Its tenant, Mr. Alvarez, called me after Martin stopped by and asked for a copy of the lease for family review. Mr. Alvarez had known Grandma for 18 years and sounded more irritated than afraid. Rose told me if anyone came asking questions after she died, I should ask whether they knew where she kept the flour scale, he said. I almost laughed for the first time in weeks. The old flour scale had been in the bakery office until Grandma moved it to her kitchen after retiring. Martin would not have known that because Martin had never helped clean the bakery after closing. I told Mr. Alvarez to send me a note describing the visit. He did. Ms. Havel added it to the trust file and sent Martin's attorney a reminder that beneficiary curiosity did not create inspection rights. It was such a dry sentence that it felt like Grandma herself might have approved. The garden land required more care. A local grower had leased 5 acres for vegetables, and his renewal was due before the end of the season. Martin wanted a market appraisal first. I wanted to renew immediately because the grower had paid on time for 9 years and had repaired the irrigation line without charging Grandma. Miss Havel told me to write the reason down before deciding. So I did. I wrote that renewing the lease preserved income, avoided vacancy, honored an existing relationship, and prevented a rushed sale narrative. I sent the explanation to every beneficiary with the lease copy. Joel replied with one word: reasonable. That one word helped more than he probably knew. Martin came to the house 3 months later. He did not come alone. Joel drove him, which told me something had shifted. Martin stood on the porch holding a small cardboard box. He looked older, less certain, and angry with himself for looking either. "I found these in Mom's things at my house," he said. The box contained old bakery ledgers, a key to the back office, and one photograph of Grandma and me standing in front of the house when I was 11. On the back, Grandma had written, "Audrey's first spring home." Martin watched me read it. "I thought she wrote things like that to make you feel better," he said. "Maybe she did. I thought it was kindness, not fact. It was both." He looked at the porch floor. "I skipped your name." "Yes." I told myself it was because the old will did not matter. "Then why skip it?" He closed his eyes. "Because hearing it would make the room remember you." That was ugly. It was also honest. I had learned by then that accountability often begins when people stop trying to make ugly things sound harmless. "Grandma remembered me," I said. "I know. The court remembered me." "I know. You did not." He swallowed. "I chose not to." Joel looked away. I think he had waited years to hear his brother say something that plain. Martin wrote a formal apology a week later. Ms. Havel kept it in the trust file. It did not erase what he had done, but it mattered because it named the act directly. He had intentionally omitted a named beneficiary during an unauthorized reading. He had attempted to change locks without authority. He had pressured Nina over her lease. For once, the words were not softened into misunderstanding. Miss Havel also asked him to send a correction to every person who had been at Serena's house that morning. Martin hated that more than the apology to me. A private apology could be managed. A correction meant the room he had tried to control would hear him undo himself. He resisted for 10 days. Then Joel called me and said Martin had finally written it. The letter was short. It said the 2014 will copy was revoked. The omitted paragraph had named me. The current trust recognized me as successor trustee, and no one should rely on the private reading. It did not sound emotional. That made it better. It sounded like a record. Nina received her copy at the cottage and brought it to me the next morning. She had underlined one sentence. "I omitted Audrey's name, and that omission was wrong." "I keep reading it," she said. "Why?" "Because he did not say everyone was confused. He said he did it." I folded the letter carefully. "That matters." "It makes me less afraid of my own memory," she said. That sentence stayed with me. I had spent so much of my life proving I belonged that I forgot other people had been taught not to trust what they saw either. Martin's correction did not only restore my name. It gave Nina permission to remember the room honestly, and it gave me permission to stop rehearsing proof in my head every night. The record could carry that now without asking me again. Serena apologized differently. She came with Grandma's aprons washed and folded, and she asked if I wanted to keep the blue one with the flower stain. Then she said, "I told myself adoption was paperwork, because paperwork felt easier to argue with than Mom's heart." I said it was both. What was? Paperwork in her heart. Serena cried then, not loudly, but with the tiredness of someone whose excuse had finally run out. The resolution was not a family miracle. Martin still struggled with not being in control. Serena still made comments that sounded polished until you heard the old hierarchy underneath. Joel became quieter but kinder. Nina finished her certificate and kept the cottage for the protected year, then chose to move closer to her new school job. She returned the keys with a receipt because she said Grandma would appreciate the formality. The house stayed in trust. The garden land was leased to a local grower. The bakery building kept its tenant. I lived in the brick house for the 24-month protection period and kept Grandma's kitchen clock 4 minutes fast. Every quarter, I send reports to the beneficiaries, even Martin. Especially Martin. Transparency was not a kindness to him. It was a boundary for all of us. On the second anniversary of Grandma's death, we held a small dinner in the garden. Mina came. Joel came. Serena brought rolls. Martin arrived late, then looked at the kitchen clock and gave the smallest, saddest smile. She would say I made a bad decision, he said. She would, I answered. He handed me a framed copy of the old photo, the one labeled my first spring home. I had it copied. The original should stay here. I took it. Thank you. He nodded, then added, I am sorry I made you hear your own name like it was up for debate. That apology reached a place in me I had kept guarded for most of my life. I did not forgive everything in that second, but I let the sentence stand without pushing it away. After dinner, Nina wound the kitchen clock because I had forgotten. It ticked too fast, just like Grandma liked it. Joel noticed and said, She really kept it 4 minutes ahead. Always, I said. Martin looked at the clock, then at the garden, where the least rows were turning green. Maybe she was trying to keep us from being late to ourselves. It was the kind of sentence Grandma would have mocked for being too fancy, but she might have liked the meaning. No one laughed at him. No one needed to. For once, the room did not punish someone for trying to say something true. Legacy is not only land, money, or the rooms people want to claim. Sometimes legacy is a name spoken clearly, a court order kept safe, and a family forced to learn that belonging does not become optional just because someone skips a line. They read the will and skipped my name on purpose, but Grandma had already written me where they could not erase me.